Welcome back to new session. This is your trainer and PMP coach Anand. This is continuation of schedule management knowledge area. In this session, you will learn sequence activities process. The learning objective of this session are: we will start with the overview to understand purpose of sequence activity process. We'll go through a process definition. We'll talk about input tool techniques and output. What are the different types of activity dependencies? What is precedence diagramming method? What are the different logical relationship between activities? And the output, that is project schedule network diagram. And finally, a quick review. Before getting into the process details, let's take a look at list of all 6 processes. Plan schedule management under planning process group. It is the process of establishing policies, procedures and documentation for project schedule. Define activities, again under planning process group. It is the process of identifying and documenting specific actions to be performed to produce the project deliverables. Sequence activities, again under planning process group. It is the process of identifying and documenting relationship among the project activities. Estimate activity duration, again under planning process group. It is the process of estimating the number of work period needed to complete individual activities. Develop schedule, planning process group. It is the process of analyzing activity sequences, duration, resource requirement and schedule constraint to create the project schedule model. And finally, control schedule, which is under monitoring and controlling process group. So first 5 processes are part of planning process group and last process is under monitoring and controlling process group. Control schedule is the process of monitoring the status of project activities to update the project progress and manage changes to the schedule baseline to achieve intended plan. In previous session, you learned define activities process, where we listed activities required to complete work package training under CRM project. If you look at the list of activities, they are randomly listed, and as of now we don't know how we will achieve goal of completing training. What is the sequence in which I have to execute these activities so that I can complete training? So what we do next? We identify the relationship between these activities and we create a logical relationship and execute them in a same order during the project execution. To summarize, in sequence activities process, the relationship among the project activities are identified and documented in order to determine the logical sequence of work to complete the project work packages or to complete the project's deliverables. Let's take a look at process definition. Sequence activities is the process of identifying and documenting relationship among the project activities. The key benefit is it defines logical sequence of work to obtain greatest efficiency within the project constraint. Let's look at inputs, tools and techniques and outputs. Inputs are project management plan, project documents, enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Project management plan. The 2 components of project management plan used as an input in this process are schedule management plan. So we are working on scheduling, hence the knowledge area management plan is a key input. It contains information like the scheduling methodology, for example, critical path method, CPM, and the scheduling tool, that is whether we are going to use Microsoft Project, Primavera. So all this information is mentioned inside your schedule management plan. And next important input is scope baseline. Scope baseline, as you know, is a combination of project scope statement, WBS and WBS dictionary. It contains information about deliverable list, assumptions, constraint, acceptance criteria. So all this information will help in identifying relationship between different activities. Project documents. These are mostly output from previous process, that is define activities. So what are these project documents? We have activity list. It lists all activities needed for the project. These activities will be sequenced in the current process. Then we have activity attributes. These are the information, additional information about activities. In previous process, few attributes were identified. Starting from current process, more attributes will be identified and documented. This process gives you attributes like predecessor or successor and logical relationship between various activities. Milestone list. It will have a scheduled date for a specific milestone, which may influence the way activities are sequenced. So sometimes you have very fixed hard milestones which you cannot exceed. In such a case, you may need to do a backward planning. Next is assumption log. It was created during development of a project charter. So the assumptions may influence the way activities are sequenced. So we will use the assumptions from this and then we will see how they will impact our sequencing. Enterprise environmental factors. So we have project management information system, within which one of the key component is a scheduling tool, which will be helpful. Organization work authorization system. It will have a workflow or approval mechanism. This is used when specific activity needs authorization from a top management to start work. Government or industry standard, particularly if the current project is similar to one done earlier. Organizational process assets. We have policies, procedures, and guidelines for developing logical relationship between activities. Templates. Templates to be used for creating network of activities or schedule network diagrams. Lesson learned repository. If a similar project is previously done, then this can help with the process of sequencing activities in the current project. So all these OPA is always useful for project and it can be useful here to sequence activities. Tools and techniques. So we have dependency determination and integration, precedence diagramming method, leads and lag, and project management information system. The first tool and technique is dependency determination and integration. The dependencies between activities can be characterized by certain attributes. So here we are determining how one activity is dependent on another activity. Dependencies can be either mandatory or discretionary, or it can be external or internal. We'll go through each dependencies in detail. Mandatory dependency. These are the dependencies that are legally or contractually required, are inherent in the nature of work. For example, unless and until client approves requirements document, vendor cannot raise an invoice. Or in this case, you can say this is simply a contractual dependency where unless and until there is a client approval, you cannot raise an invoice. Another example, some activities has inherent relationship. In this case, you lay a building foundation and then you start constructing a floor. So unless and until foundation is done, you cannot start with the next activity. So both are mandatory dependencies. Discretionary dependencies. These are the dependencies that are established through best practices within a particular industry. Discretionary dependencies are not set in the stone like mandatory dependencies. They can be modified if necessary, whereas if you remember, mandatory dependencies cannot be modified. Let's take an example. If a project team has decided to do module development in a sequence of module A followed by module B and then module C during the planning, then you can always change the sequence to module A followed by module C and module B if required based upon some project management needs. When fast tracking techniques are employed, these discretionary dependencies should be reviewed and considered for modifications or removal. Of course, it depends on the scenarios, situation. External dependencies. These are the dependencies that are usually outside of project team's control. Generally, these are non-project activities done by external party. For example, you have a project activities to dig an area to lay the pipeline using a rented machine. In this case, your activity is dependent on the external party's activity, that is deliver machine, and you have no control over it. Another example is you have signed a contract with a vendor to start the project work from 1st Jan. However, this activity is dependent on the vendor's resource getting on board a day before. Any delay in resource onboarding will delay your planned activity to start the work. And once again, you don't have control over getting vendors' resources on board on a specific date. Internal dependencies. These are the dependencies that are generally inside project team's control. Therefore, if required, these are easily modified as compared to external dependencies. For example, in a software development project, code review is an internal dependency to start system testing. However, this can be easily modified as there is a possibility of performing both code review and system testing in parallel. Another tool and technique is precedence diagramming method. It is a method of constructing a project schedule network diagram that represent activities and their relations. You can see a project schedule network diagram on the slide. Let's understand this in more detail. Observe the diagram. What you see here. Activities are represented by boxes called as nodes. Arrow shows relationship between these activities. And if an activity logically comes before another activity, then that is called as predecessor activity. If an activity logically comes after another activity, then that is called as successor activity. Let's take a simple example to build project schedule network diagram. Think of a software application which goes through requirement gathering, system design, software development, and system testing activities. You can see activity list on the slide along with their predecessor activities. So the list of activities that I mentioned earlier all are listed over here. Let's build the project schedule network diagram using this activity list. We begin with the start activity. Next, you find activity without any predecessor, so it becomes the first activity after start. So activity A, collect requirement, becomes our first activity. Activity B, that is system design, has a predecessor A. Hence, next activity is activity B, that is system testing. Logical relationship. There are four types of logical relationship between predecessor and successor activity. Observe this project schedule network diagram on your slide and you can see letters like SS, FF, which stands for start to start or finish to finish. These are written on the arrows. So these represent logical relationship between two activities. So what are these four logical relations? So we have finish to start, start to start, finish to finish, and we have start to finish. Let's understand each of them in detail with example. Finish to start. This is the most common type of logical relationship where a successor activity cannot start until the predecessor activity has finished. For example, drying the car cannot start until car is washed. Next is start to start. Another common type of logical relationship where a successor activity cannot start until the predecessor activity has started. For example, the activity of leveling the concrete cannot begin until mix and pour concrete activity begins. Note that you cannot delay activity to level concrete once mix and pour concrete activity is already started. I'm sure you understand why can't we delay the activity B. Finish to finish. Another common type of logical relationship where a successor activity cannot finish until the predecessor activity has finished. For example, broadcasting of a match cannot finish until the match is finished. Any extension of a match will result in extension to broadcasting. Next, you have start to finish. This is the least common type of logical relationship where a successor activity should start before predecessor activity finishes. For example, shift of a security guard 2 has to start before the shift of current security guard 1 is finished. Any delay in start of successor activity will delay completion of predecessor activity. Means delay in start of guard 2 shift will delay closing या completion of guard 1's shift. You will never see a door या entrance without any guard. Leads and lags. A lead is the amount of time a successor activity can be advanced with respect to a predecessor activity. For example, you have 4 weeks activity to create business requirement document followed by 4 weeks to create system requirement document. As you know, most of the cases, system requirement document can be started for a completed portion of a BRS. Hence, 1 week lead for a successor activity would mean SRS could be started 1 week prior to the completion of a predecessor activity, that's a BRS. A lag is the amount of time a successor activity can be delayed with respect to a predecessor activity. For example, here, predecessor activity is contract sign followed by a successor activity vendor team onboarded. Vendor says 3 weeks is a minimum requirement for resource onboarding. Hence, you add a lag of 3 weeks to a successor activity. A 3 week for a successor activity means it could only be started 3 weeks after the completion of a predecessor activity. And any delay in signing a contract means delay in team onboarding. Project Management Information System. This is a scheduling software that helps sequence the activities such as Microsoft Project or Primavera. Scheduling tool can create project schedule network diagram based on provided input, and it can also help setting logical relationship and also helps you to set leads, lags between the activities. The outputs for sequence activity process are project schedule network diagram and project document updates. Let's understand project schedule network diagram. It graphically represents the logical relationship between activities by having lines and arrows connecting these activities. And of course, activities are represented by nodes. Project schedule network diagram should be supported by some summary description which describes the approach that has been taken. If you observe this diagram closely, you can see activities that have multiple predecessors indicate path convergence. For example, activity E has two predecessors, that is B and D. Activities that have multiple successors indicate a path divergence. Again, for example, activity H, which has multiple successors. Activities with convergence and divergence are at the greater risk. So as a project manager, you have to observe these activities and monitor them closely. Project document updates. We have multiple project documents which might get updated as a result of this process. So first is activity list. The associated list of activity attributes may be updated as an output of this process. Activity attributes. The activity attributes that may be added after this process includes any activities that describes a necessary sequence like mandatory dependencies, predecessor-successor relationship, and lead or lags between the activities. Milestone list. Milestones on the project may be impacted by change in relationship between activities identified during this process. Of course, whenever you identify new relationship, you discover this relationship, this will definitely impact some of the milestones that has been agreed earlier on the project. Assumption log. The assumptions and constraint may be impacted by change in the relationship between activities identified during this process. For example, mandatory dependencies cannot be changed, and this may impact some existing assumptions, or it may result in identification of new assumptions. Amazing work. You have completed sequence activities process here. I know this was a long process and you have learned a lot of new concepts. I'm sure you understand them. If not, please repeat the session. Let's do a quick review. In overview, we started with understanding the purpose of sequence activity process. We gone through a process definition. We talked about input tool techniques and output. You learned different types of activity dependencies, what is precedence diagramming method, different logical relationships like finish to start, start to start, finish to finish, and start to finish, and finally output, that is project schedule network diagram. So see you in next session, that is estimate activity duration process. Thank you very much.